be our next speaker, who has interesting stuff above my head. I killed it. Okay. He'll be back. John Melillo is with us this year and last year as a new faculty fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies. Very important honor, and he's a visiting assistant professor here with us at the University of Arizona, Department of English. He's currently working on a book manuscript entitled Outside In, Noiseescapes from Dada to Punk. And he has taught a variety of classes on the relationship between sound and voice in literature and music. John Melillo has written about and presented talks on World War I poetry, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the punk singer Richard Hell, the poet Clark Coolidge, and the bands Nirvana and Sonic Youth, as well as the French sound poet Henri Chopin, and many other writers and performers. As you can see, he has a very broad set of interests. So please help me welcome and thank you for being here, John Melillo.
Thank you very much. Oh, I'm plugged in. We'll be talking a lot about this, actually. I feel both like a DJ and like a microphonic fiend. So I just first like to thank you all for being here. It's really exciting to see so many people who I know and who I don't know and who I can share some of my work with. I'd also, of course, like to thank the Humanities Week for organizing this. Dean Wilner Bassett, of course, the English department for creating such a wonderful space for me to be able to do the weird things that I do. And of course, my wife, Johanna, who luckily helped bring the power cable in so that we can actually see the stuff that I brought. And thank you again, all. So, to begin, I wanted to start by saying it's going to be weird. Well, the sounds you're going to hear are going to be strange. They're going to be weird. I am fascinated by ways of using voice that seem to take both the performer and the listener outside of themselves. I seek out voices that seem to upset and disrupt both sense and sensibility. So the etymology of the word weird is actually important here. It's an Old English and archaic Scottish term, and it originally meant fate. So the OED puts it as the principal power or agency by which events are predetermined. Voices, though we hear them as the most natural things in the world, are weird in this older sense. They seem to have an agency beyond our bodies and ourselves. We all know that strange feeling of anxiety that we get upon hearing our recorded voice. That's not me, right? You hear that and there's something alienating about it. The critic Stephen Connor has called the sense of the voice's other agent a vocalic body. So this voice, this body that's behind the voice, is a vocalic body. Every voice we hear, whether attached to a person speaking now or an entirely disembodied recorded voice, seems to conjure up this vocalic body. And the anxiety that we feel is that the vocalic body that we hear when we hear our recorded voice is not the same as ourselves. Okay? There is a never revealed agent that seems to imbue the voice with force and meaning. So I'm interested in why the voice on its own has so much force and meaning. And as you'll see, even beyond sign and syntax. Another way of figuring this vocal weirdness might be to look again at Shakespeare's Weird Sisters. The meeting between these three fates in Macbeth is certainly one of the weirdest moments in English literature. These beings, as Macbeth makes clear, seem neither in this world nor completely outside of it. Voice corresponds to that doubleness. A recent production of Macbeth at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, directed by Declan O'Donnell, even went so far as to reimagine these witches as disembodied voices. That is, Macbeth, Banquo, and the audience could hear the voices, but they did not correspond to anyone present on stage. There was no body on stage that presented those voices. I like, in particular, this John Gilbert representation of the witches because you can almost barely make them out. They just seem like wind, right? Like breath, pure voice. I think this dramaturgical choice is engaging because it seems to expose the power of the voice. Both internal and external voices, voices we hear and voices we imagine, demand our attention. Like Macbeth, we cannot not listen. So, to rapidly move from Shakespeare to the 20th century, I'd like to describe a tradition today, beginning in that century and continuing today, of writers and performers who attempt to occupy a space between word and weird. That is, who use voice in a way that exposes the weird power of voice to go beyond the boundaries of the communicative or the authoritative. These artists play with the very definition of the human in voice. Aristotle himself defines voice as a human thing. Right? Human voices are sounds with soul, ensouled voices, whereas animal voices are merely noises. So that very division between what's voice and noise is at the root of what counts as a community, what counts as people who can be a part of the polis. These voices in this 20th century tradition that I'm going to describe show how malleable the dividing line between voice and noise, between meaningful and meaningless sounds, between the human and the inhuman can be. While we must account, of course, for the fact that the mutability of voice has a long historical and traditional context, it was in the 20th century, in the midst of vast industrial and technological expansion, which included the advent of new forms of oral and visual media, as well as the upheaval of the World War I. It is this space, the 20th century, where this mutability becomes most defamiliarizing, alien, and grotesque, but also transformative and sublime. For many avant-garde writers at the beginning of the century, this was a question related to the 19th century symbolist movement of containing as much as possible within the voice. But the kinds of things a voice could contain were wildly transformed. Rather than amorphous and resonating ambiguities, excuse me, rather than amorphous, can you hear me like this, or is it better? Rather than amorphous and resonating ambiguities, or subtle psychological and philosophical layers, we hear the sounds of machines, noise, and confusion. So I'm going to begin by talking about the work of the Italian futurist F.T. Marinetti. He's exemplary in this regard. So here's an example of his words and freedom, parole and libertà. He invented this visually striking typography in a way that would mimetically reflect the industrial and militaristic future he saw and desired. Marinetti would perform these poems and use an unabashedly onomatopoetic voice. He would attempt to transform his voice into a kind of recording machine of war. This man-machine hybrid glorified war and noise. For Marinetti, war was the world's only hygiene. We can feel that violence and power in his voice, as if he were ventriloquizing war and its confusions, not through an anthropomorphic voice of a god of war, for instance, but by actually becoming a medium for war's destructive power. Bombardamento di Adrianopoli, parole in libertà. Ogni 5 secondi cannoni d'assedio per entrare spazio con un accordo. Amusamente il 500 echi per accannarlo, svilupparlo, spantagliarlo all'infinito. E il tempo di quel tanto dubbi, ampiezza 50 km quadrati, alzare, coppiarsi, tubi, batterie, scivolati. Violenza, ferocia, fresco, la, questo va? So, the idea of a lyric as a kind of sonic space allowing for an attacking, performative force still exists today, perhaps most plainly in the violent and warlike verses of many rappers. But we'll talk more about that soon. I still want us to go through this avant-garde story of voice in extremis, as Steve McCaffrey, who's a critic who writes about these things, called it. Even more compelling than Marinetti's onomatopoetic drive, which of course you guys could hear, yes? Without even knowing Italian, you can hear the tom, tom, right? The kind of ways in which he's attempting to make the machine gun and the sound of explosions come out in his voice. So even more compelling than this onomatopoetic drive, for me, is the voice of Dada. The Dadaists were a group of expatriate writers, artists, and dropouts who fled to neutral Switzerland during World War I. Hugo Ball, Emmy Hennings, Tristan Tzara, and Richard Hilsenbach were among the leaders of the movement. In 1916, excuse me, they organized a series of performances under the name Cabaret Voltaire in this unassuming place at Spiegelgasse 6. So the Cabaret Voltaire was actually in the back of a rundown bar in the middle of Zurich. There are some stories that at the same time, of course, as the Dadaists, James Joyce and V.I. Lenin were in Zurich. We don't know if they ever actually went to the Cabaret Voltaire, but it was a kind of place where a lot of revolutionary stuff was happening in 1915, 1916, 1917. So these poets also ventriloquized war, but they did it in the exact opposite process of Marinetti, through abstraction and negation. They created sound poetry, as Hugo Ball called it, a poetry without words. And these sound poems were made up of the phonemes, the sounds of language, but they were detached from any specific signification. For Hugo Ball, the war was ultimately a problem of language. He wrote in 1915, "If language really makes us kings of our nation, then without doubt it is we, the poets and thinkers, who are to blame for this bloodbath and have to atone for it." By destroying language, by voicing a kind of mute language made up only of abstracted phonemes and vocal performance, Ball sought to cleanse language of the nationalist myths that led to World War I. Sadly, no recordings of Ball's performances exist, but he did write about his first performance of these sound poems. He dressed up in a costume, seen here. Oh, I don't have the costume. It's in the very first picture. This costume. He dressed up in this costume, which, as you can kind of see, is a chimera. He's part bird, part crab, with his claws here. It's made out of cardboard, supposedly, and it was colored a kind of metallic blue, from what they tell us. Here's what he said about the performance. And I'm going to quote it at length, so I'll put it up here. Oh, I don't have it up there. The stresses became heavier. You just have to listen. The stresses became heavier. The emphasis was increased as the sound of the consonants became sharper. Soon I realized that if I wanted to remain serious, and I wanted to at all costs, my method of expression would not be equal to the pomp of my staging. The heavy vowel sequences and the plodding rhythm of the elephants in Caraway, which we'll listen to soon, had given me one last crescendo. But how was I to get to the end? Then I noticed that my voice had no choice but to take on the ancient cadence of priestly lamentation, that style of liturgical singing that wails in all the Catholic churches of East and West. I do not know what gave me the idea of this music, but I began to chant my vowel sequences in a church style like a recitative, and tried not only to look serious, but to force myself to be serious. For a moment it seemed as if there were a pale, bewildered face in my cubist mask, that half-frightened, half-curious face of a 10-year-old boy, trembling and hanging avidly at the priest's words in the requiems and high masses in his home parish. Then the lights went out, as I had ordered, and bathed in sweat, I was carried down off the stage like a magical bishop. So, to supplement this description, here's a recording of one of Ball's sound poems that he performed that night. It's Carawan, or Elephanton Carawan, Elephant Caravan, and it's performed by, yes, Marie Osmond.
Hawani Jolifanto Blamba Ofali Hambla. Grostiga me Pafla Habla Hornigaga Golman. High Bloblo Icora Sula Huji. Holaka Holala. And Logobang, Blagobang, Blagobang Baso Futaka. Ooh. Shampa Uwala Wasa. Olobo. Hechtada Gorem Estet Zumbada. Wubu Susuba de Ulowa Susuba de Tamba. Baumf. Katsagama. Baumf.
Marie Osmond. So that was on a show in the 1980s called Ripley's Believe It or Not. Did anybody watch that show? Great. I never did, but now I know at least one cool thing happened. What's so jarring about the description of Ball's performance and Osmond's recorded performance brought together is not only that her hallmark country persona does not seem to match the sheer force of the voice emanating from her, but also that Ball's own voice cannot contain the energies he imagines within the poem. Right? He has to suddenly go into this liturgical chant. The poem seems beyond the body of the person speaking it. Both Ball and Marie Osmond are possessed. In his sound poetry, Ball makes manifest a sense of the voices being caught up in an inhuman and mechanical system outside of the self. Like religious fits of ecstasy that result in glossolalia, this is a power of sound that penetrates and dissolves selves in favor of a larger agency. Sound seems to control, to overcome us, to penetrate us. For Ball, this is not just a kind of terrifying religious ritual, but war itself. This is a knowing and ironic, right? He has to keep serious. This is a knowing and ironic vocal anti-humanism that parallels war's anti-humanism. By dismembering the body of language, by imagining humans as mere noise-making machines, he shows how war itself dismembers bodies and imagines humans as mere machines. This necessity of dismembering language, of ecstatically separating the voice from the self, took on its own energy, and avant-garde poets continued to granulate language more and more in an effort to separate language and meaning from the voice. So there was an attempt to get smaller and smaller bits of meaning out of these vocal poems. After the war, Dadaism became an international movement with nodes in Paris, New York, and Berlin, and many poets continued to develop Ball's sound poetry into what Hulsenbeck called bruitism, or noisism. Raoul Hausmann created poetry based not upon phonemes but letters, and he would perform these poems in ways that emphasized playfulness, shock, and the alphabet's disintegration in the mouth. So this is an example of one of Hulsenbeck's poems, and they were large poster-sized poems that he would make in this for 1918, a very it looks like a very advertising kind of poems. So there's this idea that poetry was in the public world, dominating the public world, yelling out inside of the public world. And here is an example of a
Mesdames, Messieurs, les Dadazov vous récite quelques poèmes de 1918. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dadazov speaks some historical poems phonetic from 1918. Meine Damen, meine Herren, der Dadazov spricht für Sie einige historische Lautgedichte von 1918. Noum, on a poo, et so, kill, kolum, snoom, da do, da, iridadunt, tnoom, kolacum, onomund, fums, that's pagil,
I've listened to that more times than I can tell you. I wonder if it would be interesting actually to do a cover of that. That's what my new sound poetry group is going to do, covers of that. So the desire to find ever more minute ways of subdividing language, thereby releasing mouth sounds from the strictures of meaning and syntax, became pervasive in the new avant-gardes of the mid-century. Influenced heavily by Dada, poets and composers we would now think of as postmodern care more and more about finding an ascetic voice, stripped of all signification. Isidore Isou, a Romanian immigrant and the founder of the French lettrist movement, performed poems filled with repetition and a wide range of mouth sounds. They ranged from the guttural to the pointillistic. Here's an example of one of his poems. It's from the beginning of a poem called Marble for Dante, Hell.
Marbre pour Dante. Enfer. Taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop. Ha, ha. Taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop. Ha. Taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop. Ha, ha. Taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop, taratsin-pop. Ha. You gotta go.
It goes on for a while, but you can hear the way that the voice is sort of, even more than in Houseman, right? We hear the kind of really guttural, really harsh, damaging kind of sound of the voice. This is less circus performer and more just damaged. Moving on from Isou, though, eventually this effort of performing smaller and smaller bits of voice resulted in Gilles Wohlmann, his poems called mega news, mega breaths. So rather than the letter, right, rather than basing a poem on a letter and then disarticulating the letter, what we get with Gilles Wohlmann is a series of breaths. That's actually not totally off topic, because the phone call on the other end of the line of just the breathing, right, it gives you the exact same sense here of impending doom. Right? There's something terrifying about being confronted with breath in such a close way. And he clearly, as you notice, right, there's no articulation at all, right? There's an attempt only to breathe, to not use any of the other stuff that's going on in our mouths, right? It's all from the throat, all from an open mouth. And sort of seeing the expressive effects or the possibilities that come from that, right? It's both terrifying and sort of wondrous, because this is something every single time we communicate that we're doing. We're breathing out in that same way. It's just that we never notice it. Of course, his poetry, and this also connects to the telephone, is only made possible through sound recording. You can't write breaths necessarily. The experimental desire for ever greater disconnects between voice and text actually transformed the voice itself into a kind of text, a thing that could be recorded, repeated, and remembered, even in its arbitrariness. For some voice makers, the power of voice connected with the recording apparatus itself. And this is something that Gilles Wohlmann is doing, but even more was a friend and student of his, Henri Chopin, who was a French sound poet, post-war, and who was actually a member of the French military who was in World War II, captured by the Nazis, put in a camp, and escaped from that camp in Eastern Europe and eventually got home from this escape only a few years after the war. So it was this long, arduous journey of living in the wilderness and living away. And so there's something about Henri Chopin's biography that seems to connect here too with the kind of poetry that you'll hear in just a second. So what Henri Chopin did was create these intricate patterns of noise that he termed audio poems. And by recording and re-recording the various sounds of his mouth, he could create these layers, these intricate layers and grids. So this is an example of a typewriter poem that he also made. So he was very interested in all sorts of kinds of concrete poetry. This is an example of an audio poem. Integral dynamism. You can actually hear, I feel like, that aspect of being integral, right? The way in which the layers of different mouth sounds stack up on top of each other. Of course, these sounds sound like neither poetry nor music, nor do they necessarily sound human or inhuman. It's hard for us to make out that this is actually all composed from stuff that happens here, along with, of course, a microphone. So what Chopin would do is put the microphone inside of his mouth to create some of those feedback tones that you hear, the high, at the same time. I wouldn't do it myself, but if you put the microphone in your mouth, it does create this resonant frequency that will eventually create a feedback noise here in this room, for instance, but I won't do that. But Henri Chopin would combine the microphone, its different lengths and distances from the mouth, even inside of the mouth, and he would also record those things that seem to happen outside of the mouth, right? When you talk, that sort of leftover, you can kind of hear it in the dynamisme integral. You can hear the way that the slurpy, kind of gooey, bodily stuff is also going on at the same time that it's all chopped up and cut up. Maybe I'll play it just a little bit more, just so. So you get the picture of the creatives. So instead of a human, we get this organized set of almost insect or cicada-like sounds, constructed, again, out of mouth sounds, electronic feedback. These sounds create a grid-like and confusing space. And again, it is very similar to kind of grid-like and confusing space that the typewriter allows for him. Of course, this distribution of infinitesimal bits of voice results in a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Right? We get to Wollmann, and what we have is almost a voice degree zero. And so what Henri Chopin does is build something else out of a voice degree zero. The voice, at its most fragmented and recombined, here becomes noise, a kind of sound that remains recalcitrant to speech and language. However, that weird sense remains, via the power of the recording mechanism. The voice, cut up as it is, remains caught up within an unbidden power, a force that terrifies us as it plugs into and disintegrates larger networks of social meaning and social power. Chopin famously said that the body is a sound factory. The technologized vocalic body within Chopin's work presents us with a sense of the sublime, a play between terrorizing closeness and distance as the body and our listening selves remain caught up in these systems of dismemberment and distortion. Technology allows us to literally violate and cut up the voice. This is not, of course, too far from Hugo Ball's sense of the necessity to escape from language into voice. But there is a change. Ball seems to need voiced noise to transcend, right, and escape the disingenuous language of war. Chopin never transcends. We are overwhelmed by the smacks, the muck, the grime of these sounds. Chopin's voice itself seems to internalize Ball's chimeric costume. It becomes a multiple object without any sense of resolution or escape. In a way, Chopin's noise allows us to experience, for a moment, the confusions of a vastly expanded world imbued with heterogeneous information and images that we cannot map or sift through. It gives us a sense of that vast world that we just can't know for a brief moment. The chimeric voice of Chopin, both human and animal, human and technological, is really an experiment with the way we encounter voice every day. Voices are constantly mediated by recording technology and sound synthesizers. Often the layers of that technology, the multiple tracks of a recorded song, for instance, are covered over and hidden from us so that we can imagine that same studio recording as a kind of cohesive portrayal, right? A unified object of voice, lyric, and music. When we listen to a track, we don't often think about all the different tracks that make it up. This imaginary cohesion, however, is becoming less and less common as we increasingly accept that no recorded song exists as a singular entity. It is always right to be sampled, remixed, mashed up, or chopped and screwed. Voice is now caught up in a system of nearly infinite permeability and mutability. As such, performers themselves are often playing with the status of voice. Rather than fetishizing the particular qualities of a rock singer's voice, his or her grain, we now appreciate voices that are twisted beyond recognition, whether through performance or technology. And here, of course, I think of our love of auto-tune. But besides auto-tune, there's also the performative aspect, and this is where Nicki Minaj finally comes in. Nicki Minaj is, of course, one of the best examples of such a voice, such a performer who performs many voices. In her songs and in her daily performances, she creates a series of different personas defined by different looks and sounds. Minaj plays a schizophrenic self, a self of multiple determinations and multiple voices. She has made a lot of music in the past few years, but perhaps the verse that garnered the most attention from listeners is her verse in Kanye West's song and collaboration, Monster, which I bet almost everybody in here has already heard. Has everybody heard Monster? All right. It is a truly, as you'll see very soon, it's a truly unhinged performance. And she shifts from these multiple personas. So she goes from an aggressive, attacking male persona named Roman to a high-voiced Barbie persona named Barbie. And for a few moments, there's this strange English accented proposition. I'd like to know more about what you guys think about the English accent. So excuse the use of YouTube here.
With thick ass, give them whiplash. I think big, get cash, make them blink fast. Now look. Pull up in a monster automobile gangster with a bad bitch that came from Sri Lanka. Yeah, I'm in a tanga, color of Willy Wonka. You could be the king, but watch the queen conquer. First things first, I'll eat your brain. Then I'ma start rocking gold teeth and fangs. Cause that's what a motherfucking monster do. He a dresser from Milan, that's the monster do. Monster just every heel, that's the monster show. Young Money is the roster and a monster crew. And I'm all up in the bank with the funny face. And if I'm fake, I ain't know this cause my money ain't.
Let me get this straight, wait, I'm the rookie. But my features and my shows 10 times you pay. 50K for a verse, no album out. Yeah, my money's so tall that my Barbie's gotta climb it. Hotter than a Middle East and climb it. 20 my Thailand, but they wind it. Nicki on the middle when I fight it. All these niggas are one track minded. Really, I don't give a F-U-C-K. Forget
So the Minaj is, of course, as in ménage à trois, which is, of course, also her last name. This little pun leads, though, to a larger point. Ménage is a menagerie of voices, and the way she shifts from one to the other in this very single verse is a virtuosic display that shatters the idea of a natural voice in favor of an always assumed, always performative voice. A body here is a medium for voices, and those voices speak through it. Feelings, ideas, rhythms, sounds act like free radicals. That is, they are always ready to integrate and possess us at any moment. So I want to close by talking about a performance that happened here, right here, just last week, by the poet Joelle McSweeney. And her performance was exceptional for many reasons, and it's not up on the VOCA website on the Poetry Center's VOCA website yet, excuse me. But when it is, you should go and listen to it, because it really draws together many of the ideas in this talk today. What you'll hear, when you do hear it, is a poet possessed. McSweeney began with a series of poems that she called the King Prion poems. King Prion for her is an allegory for all the technological supplements that make up our lives now. Pills, phones, computers, hearing aids. The things that we carry both are and are not a part of us. She calls out and announces King Prion with a kind of weird computer-like yodel. I'll try to do it. Is that okay for people inside? This phatic sound, both a call for human contact and a kind of mechanical beat, is, to end where I began, weird. It presents a kind of agency in language or in technology that seems to rewrite our fate. What she seems to be saying is, if our voices are never our own, then whose voice will speak with us? What kind of a voice can we choose, or at least choose to know, in a world that constantly asks us to plug in, turn on, and tune out? Thanks, guys. Any questions?
Thank you, John, very much. Hello. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. And since we are such a large group, if you have some questions, I'll bring around the mic just so everyone can hear them. So while we're waiting for people to stop being shy, I would like to thank, while we're waiting, and ask you for some applause for our staff, who has done such a wonderful job in making this whole week happen, and especially all of that you're enjoying. So I'm thanking especially Helen Bernard, Amanda Hunt, and Melissa Miller, and those who have helped. There are several of them. So if you could stand up and wave and let us thank you, please. Thank you. So questions for John?
So if you accept that Dada was in reaction to something and disliked something and wanted to improve something, do you accept that premise about Dada, and had an entertainment component, do you now see that, whether it's Nicki Minaj or take your choice, the emphasis is entertainment and not much at all reaction and wanting to change and wanting to improve? Is that accurate or a little too overstated?
I think that's both accurate and overstated. Because, yes, I think Dada, if we're going to create a spectrum between kind of entertainment, pleasure value, and social critique, Dada seems to, at least on the surface, to be over here, and Nicki Minaj seems to be way over here. But I'm interested in finding the ways that we can listen to that which seems to be all the way over here and hear the kind of revolutionary potential. I mean, if we take Nicki Minaj at her word, right, which when we kind of listen closely to what she's doing, we are forced to do, right? We're so often caught up in a system where we actually don't believe in what pop musicians say. It's all sort of so caught up in an ironic and kind of distant system that we are just kind of like, whatever. But if we take her at her word, then there is some potential for reading it in a way that makes us think again about what our daily life is like, if that makes sense.
That was great, John. Thanks a lot. I'd be really interested to hear you talk about the import, especially for the earlier sound poets, of reproducibility. You know, some of the performances that you played for us seemed virtually unreproducible in any kind of consistent way. So was there a relationship between, or were they theorizing or thinking about the relationship between improvisation and accuracy, or was that something that was not a part of their lexicon?
That's a good question. Other Dadaist sound poets, most notably Kurt Schwitters, he wrote a poem called Sonata, and Sonata was supposed to be music in language, so he actually organized it in sonata form. And the idea, of course, by using musical language and musical organization is that then you can reproduce that particular moment of voice again and again if you follow the directions. Of course, we get caught up in interpretation and all those kinds of questions that come from music theory. But I think when it gets later in the century, and you're talking about somebody like Henri Chopin, for them the medium is the recording mechanism itself. And so that's the writing. And so the performance happens in relationship to the recording, the studio recording, you might say. And so that reproducibility is the final text. And that's meant to be it, right? There's not supposed to be an actual letristic, alphabetic component between the voice and that kind of writing on the tape, right? So it's the tape itself is a kind of writing, a magnetic writing. So for them, that reproducibility in performance is not as important as sort of getting that one take that is important. But of course, there's a doubleness too, and this is, some writers have talked about how recording technology in many ways created the conditions for jazz, because you have improvisation happening that can then be captured in the recording mechanism. And so yeah, sometimes some takes suck, but then other takes can be kept, and that allowed for that kind of space of improvisation, but that could also be stored and retrieved. And so I think that something similar is happening with the Volnon and Chopin.
Do you know the circumstances in which Marie Osmond came to perform this Dada? It's so delightful. How on earth did that happen?
I'm not totally certain. I got the recording from, and all of these recordings really, from this amazing website called ubu.com, U-B-U, which you should all go to and check out all the weird stuff that's on it. On ubu.com, there's a brief explanation, and basically this recording came about while she was on Ripley's Believe It or Not, so I think she was put up to it, and she knew it, and she wanted to do it, but there was some story that they didn't think they had enough time, but she really wanted to do it. So she was clearly very into the poem, and the story that is told is from a critic named Grail Marcus, who wrote an amazing book called Lipstick Traces, A Secret History of the 20th Century, which talks a lot about the same stuff in relation to punk rock music. And it's part of the soundtrack for Lipstick Traces too. So Grail Marcus will know the full story. You should ask him.
I'm curious about something. Ken mentioned import of the earlier Dadaists and the voice poets of that time period. And I'm curious as to what some of their inspirations may have been. I know that many of the earlier artists of that time period got some of their inspiration following I guess the imperialist path of some of the first world countries as they colonized parts of Africa. And I'm curious as to whether or not these voice poets also heard some of these sounds that they tried to reproduce as a part of that path.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And that's another story that should definitely be told here, because one of the major poets, Tristan Tzara of Zurich Dada, actually thought of himself as somewhat of an anthropologist, and so there were a lot of these, just flat out primitivist kinds of songs. And Richard Hilsenbeck, another poet, also had this idea that he wanted to drum literature into the ground, and he wanted to use a big African drum, and so they were definitely taking part in those same kind of anthropological fantasies that first world countries were doing at the time. And so, yes, Zurich Dada was caught up in that. Hugo Ball was sort of connected with that just because it was in the air, but he's more, as you can kind of hear, via Marie Osmond, a kind of, there's more Latin and there's kind of like that version of archaicism, right? Versus the primitivist version.
That was fantastic, by the way.
Thanks.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that talk. I have a question about what would they say to the human impulse to generate sense from sound? So even though you say it blocks our ability to resolve it into some kind of meaning, we still want to, right? And it kind of plays with that. And I kept thinking, because of my own interests and also because it's October and Halloween is approaching, of Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, where a raven comes in and squawks a bunch, right? And a guy hears the word nevermore and starts asking questions so that he can come out of this nothingness, which is sound, and discover some significance, which is that there is nothing. So what would they say about that impulse to, let's say somebody heard one of their poems and said, I know exactly what you mean. You were saying X. What would be their response? Or what would you imagine?
Right, well, yeah, I can't speak necessarily for either Ball, but I think that on the one hand, they would push away from that, because that's very similar to sort of looking at an abstract painting and seeing, oh, I see a birthday cake, So there's a certain aspect related to that sense of abstraction where they want you to be kind of involved in the pure, icky materiality of it. And yet, at the same time, and perhaps this is a problem with them imagining a kind of progressive furthering into the ickiness, right? Like the kind of further and further they get into the materiality, the more and more immaterial it gets. Gilles Vauban is just breath, right? And yet, even in those breaths, we can, of course, still be projecting meaning, right? So noise is always a space, right, as in Nevermore, as always a space for ghosts to start coming out. And the human capacity to anthropomorphize and turn noise into voice is nearly infinite. And so they're trying to disrupt that to make us realize, well, we're not, that voice is on a relative scale, right? That voice isn't natural, that it actually is on the scale of all noises, and therefore kind of all caught up in the earthy stuffiness of the world.
Thanks, John. I guess I'm thinking about algae in the tentacles. So the last 6 times I've seen you with a microphone, you are performing sound for audiences. So if this is your academic approach to sound, what is your artistic approach to sound, or can you explain how you contribute to that discourse?
It's funny to actually think about them together, which I have in sort of flippant ways, but I've never had to in front of people like this. But I think for me, from a creative standpoint, I love the way that we can both, I'm more of the camp of finding voice inside of noise. So rather than sort of just concentrating on the sickening, terrifying effects of noise, I want there always to be some possibility or ghost of voice or melody inside of the noise. So I'm still ultimately a romantic humanist, despite my interest in this really anti-humanist stuff.
You distinguish between human voice and that of animals, but I swear I can understand my cat sometimes. And also I was wondering what you thought of like vocalizations of infants who are beginning to tell us something as they grow. I mean, does that tie into anything that you're doing?
Yes, both questions. The vocalizations of animals and of infants. Animals, of course, are not, as Aristotle says, just pure noise making. They're not just mechanical machines, right? And thinking about animals in relation to humans, right? And also relativizes voice, right? It puts human voice on a different scale of vocalization, along with cats and whales and everything. So that's something important to think about. The other side of that, the cry of the baby, that's, I mean, I feel like to a certain extent that's what they're all trying to get back to. The cry of the baby is this immediate call, right, that says, attend to me, right? And even though it's kind of pure voicing for voice's sake, it also immediately connects us to a social system. And so I think what they're trying to do is make apparent the way that voice, plugs us into that social system, the way that cry actually demands a response.
I was just curious if you were familiar. I believe the author was Samuel Beckett. He wrote a play that basically was someone taking a deep breath.
Yes. Yeah, breath. Right. And the stage is completely dark. I mean, there's just the mouth. The actor is completely in black, and then there's just and that's.
Yes, the reason why I brought it up was because the way it was described in one of the classes I took is it still had that basic plot structure of rising action, climax, and falling action within just one breath.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I enjoyed it.
I enjoy that too. That's not. It's very true, of course, right? The moment this is what gets back to Paul's question, right? That even as we attempt to find that thing that's completely outside of meaning, we can still kind of attach it to something that will structure it.
And would that fall under the same category of everything we talked about?
Yeah, I think so. I think that Beckett, like these other, like Isu and like Volman, is an ascetic, right? He's like that kind of late modernism that attempts to strip down things to their absolute minimalist versions of themselves. I like Craps Last Tape is also a great Beckett play that kind of deals with some of these same questions, especially in relation to sound recording. And in Craps Last Tape, we have this person listening back to the tapes that he's made as a younger man, and the kinds of alienation from that past self, that other voice that happen when you actually listen to it on tape.
Hi, I was wondering if any of these early people during
today, singers collaborate
Yes.
with each other?
Yes, yeah. So to give you a full picture of Dada collaboration, Tristan and Sarah created what he called the first simultaneous poem, where 4 of the poets, including Richard Gilsenbeck and Emmy Hennings, who was Hugo Ball's wife and who was also a cabaret singer, they all read poetry together. So he created a score, and they were all reading together, and the voices, of course, mashed up and turned it into just this big jumble of noise. So there was a heavy collaborative effort by all of the Dadaists. So they certainly were not in the camp of individual geniuses sort of working in their rooms. They were rather out creating entertainments, creating ways to shock people, and so they had to work together. Even in Hugo Ball's presentation of his performance, he had, there's a kind of theatrical effect of turning off all the lights as he collapses as the magical bishop, and he needed Sarah and others to perform those effects during the sound poem. So another aspect of the sound poem, of course, is that we are missing the context completely of Cabaret Voltaire and of that kind of shocking space that involved a whole bunch of other people.
In the, am I speaking properly? In the or the war poems that were undertaken, what happens, we hear what happens to us, we know what happens to us, but what happens to the artist performing the noise or the sound of the drums? Something happens within the poet or the lady who was performing. Is that part of the experience? Is that part of the breath?
Part of the experience for us, or, of course, I
well,
think...
it's two-way for the artist. There's the performance, but there's the repetition.
And our identification with the artist is also an identification with their splitting of self. And I think that part of what's really going on in these poems and in these sound poems is that ecstatic performance, right? And even with Nicki Minaj, and I think that's maybe the larger point of the whole talk, is that voice seems to always enter us ecstatically and seems to take over and possess, and in a way that we often don't recognize.
You okay with me long? You okay with me long?
Oh, no.
So, continuing with the poets who made noise poetry to emulate war with like almost nothing but, well, I guess nothing but onomatopoeia, do you think that like lyrics, say from Nicki Minaj, who actually use real language, recognizable language, do you think that takes away or diminishes the effect of the like oral dynamism that the noise poets attempted?
I don't think it takes away from the effect, actually, because I think it's really interesting that on the one hand there is there's meaning behind it. We can put together something that's going on in Minaj's lyrics, but I don't think that necessarily takes away from. In fact, I think they kind of work together. It takes away from the really heavy, intense rhythmic stuff that she's doing. There's the stuttering, the kind of breaks, the use of voice to kind of create a noisy space even before we ever even attend to what the meanings are. I mean, it's much easier to understand what's going on, of course, when we have the text playing for us. But I feel like it would take multiple listenings for us to kind of understand completely all of the wordplay that's happening there. And so that ambiguous wordplay is really important for the sonic effect.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of you for that wonderful discussion, and John Melillo once again, please, everybody.